All right, because we have a lot to talk about, I'm going to get started while people are still joining. As I said before, welcome back. It's great to be back. We took the summer off. This is the CRC Roundtable, our monthly virtual seminar series. Just to remind you, our intention is always to host targeted and inclusive and informed conversation about scientific advances and management needs. And we try to navigate in this sort of space where we're all not quite sure what to do. The webinars are designed for contribution, not consumption. And as a reflection of that, the panelists have been given about 25 minutes total to make some introductory remarks, allowing 30 minutes for discussion. I will facilitate that discussion both out of the chat and from a list of previously submitted questions. This is all about you and about us asking or giving us the place to ask the clumsy questions and to really practice the bravery and humility that we all need. So let me start, as I always do, by understanding why this topic at this time by these speakers. It occurred to me that the issue of debris in our waterways is a lot like the debris itself. So obvious in the moment or two, or while we are holding it, then quickly out of sight and out of mind. How big is the problem? Let's start local and then go global. Current estimates of just plastic pollution in the world's waterways is staggering. And so recent estimates, 11 million metric tons of plastic enter the oceans annually. And that figure is projected to triple by 2040 if no action is taken. And so what is 11 million metric tons? I think a great analogy is a garbage truck full of plastic every minute for an entire year. Or if you prefer your weight in elephants, it's basically the combined weight of 1.6 million African elephants. Why should we care? Locally, an analysis of microplastic presence on water samples that were taken by Dr. Lance Yankos from the University of Maryland found that 98% of the Chesapeake Bay samples, 96% of the coastal mid-Atlantic samples contained microplastics. So it's in our water, it's in our beer, it's in us. If that ingestion of plastics isn't enough of a challenge for our living resources, there's the issue of derelict fishing gear. And I won't go through that globally, but certainly locally, a NOAA-funded study estimated that there are 145,000 derelict crab pots in Chesapeake Bay, and they continue to kill about an estimated 3.3 million blue crabs every year. And all of us who have been keeping an eye on crab numbers know what a problem that is. So what can be done? Our speakers are the best experts poised to tell us. Kelly Summers is well-versed in what human impacts can do to aquatic environments, from her graduate work in wetlands to her current role doing field work and research into plastic pollution and their potential impacts on the environment, watersheds, and human health, most notably in Chesapeake Bay and the Mid-Atlantic. Similarly, Renee Sanders has worked in a variety of habitats to protect wildlife, from work in Arizona to California to Virginia Sea Grant to VIMS. And she's now the project manager for the National Derelict Fishing Trap Removal Assessment and Prevention Program, which looks at impacts from a variety of species, from lobsters to mangrove crabs, and on both coasts. If speakers, each of you have extensive experience, and you could fill an hour by yourself. I will gracefully let you know when you are at the 12-minute mark. And know that if you have material that you're unable to share, we'll find a way to make it available to attendees. The most important part of this hour is certainly the opportunity for attendees to have access to you and to ask the brave and clumsy questions. So please help me do that. And with no further ado, I will let Kelly have the stage.
Great. Thanks for the introduction. Obviously, this is a very positive topic with all those staggering numbers you just shared. So let me share my PowerPoint here. And then I'm going to go here. And can you give me a thumbs up or confirm that you just see my slides? Okay. All right, so hi, Kelly Summers. I work for the EPA Region 3 office, which is headquartered in Philly. So we do all of the work in the Mid-Atlantic. One of the hats I wear as a senior watershed coordinator is the regional liaison for the trash-free waters and microplastics program. So before I talk about Chesapeake Bay specific work, I just will briefly touch on the National EPA Trash-Free Waters Program. It's a voluntary partnership program that collaborates with stakeholders from a variety of disciplines and scales, local, federal, state. The program has 3 pillars, which is prevention, removal, and research. The program supports a variety of projects under these pillars, whether it be source reduction strategies, physical removal, as well as research into different strategies for reducing aquatic trash. The program also has newsletters, webinar series. The website has loads of information, technical documents on how to stem the flow of trash, particularly plastics from entering our waterways. And then each region does have a coordinator. Like I said, I'm the region 3 one. So if you fall outside of the Mid-Atlantic region, I have a counterpart in all 10. And then the Mid-Atlantic office has a more unique side where we have some regulatory programs in place to support our voluntary program of trash-free waters, where there is some language in some of our MS4 stormwater permits and TMDL regarding aquatic trash. So just like Denise kind of went through, we've all read the headlines on the sheer amount of trash and plastics in the ocean. This graphic's just a cool little graphic kind of to orient ourselves on how we even get plastics in our waterways. So they can kind of be through 2 ways, whether it's runoff from land-based sources, which I think this little figure summarizes all the different ways that could happen, or from direct input, which would be, for instance, like fishing gear that fell off a boat or a derelict vessel, which you'll hear about in the next talk, I think a little bit of. But 80% of the plastics we find in our waterways is from mismanaged land trash, whether it's littering, intentional releases like balloon releases, or flipped over trash cans and bins. So I'm going to get specific now and really focus the rest of the talk on the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So what do we know? We know that microplastics are ubiquitous in the Bay. Again, Denise gave some stats on some existing projects that looked at microplastics in both tidal and non-tidal waters, and we have found Chesapeake Bay has presence of microplastics in both tidal and non-tidal water. This was a paper that came out in 2020 that did some surface water samples. Of the 30 samples, every single sample had plastics in them, and then a subset of those samples were investigated for their specific composition, their polymer composition, and polyethylene was the most dominant. So we do know that Chesapeake Bay does have this issue. So plastics research really ramped up in the watershed in early 2019, thanks to the STAC and Denise's leadership, when they hosted a workshop to assess the state of science around microplastics in the watershed. Goals of the workshop were to understand the status and trends, identify policy and management tools, identify research and data gaps. The recommendations from that workshop were to establish an action team, develop risk assessments, review and develop a terminology document and size classification for broad application, develop a source reduction strategy, and to collaborate on a monitoring network. All of these recommendations were presented to the management board. After that presentation, the management board authorized the formation of an action team called the Plastic Pollution Action Team, which we call the PPAT. I was scrolling through the attendees and I noticed there's quite a few current and former PPAT members on today's talk. So thank you to all of those members. It's made up of a group of experts and stakeholders supporting and overseeing plastics research in the Chesapeake Bay. The PPAT collaborates on design, interpretation, and conclusions of research studies and help to identify data gaps, knowledge gaps, and direct research. In the spring of 2020, EPA's Region 3 Water Division, where I work, funded 3 contracts awarded 3 contracts to start addressing the recommendations from the workshop with support and expertise of the PPAT. So I'm going to go through each of those initial 3 project tasks. So again, EPA funded a contractor who was Tetra Tech to work with the Plastic Pollution Action Team to develop a uniform size classification and unit terminology document, which is a mouthful. Standardized size classifications are important because it helps us be able to share results, and those results are comparable among studies in the Bay program. So what we did was we defined microplastic and nanoplastic. You can see on the table those size classifications. So 5 millimeters to 1,000 nanometers is what we mean when we say microplastics. And then setting the concentrations across different medias was also part of this process. Again, we could help encourage standardized monitoring and broaden the capacity to share and utilize data among stakeholders within the watershed, because we don't expect one single entity to be responsible for all plastics research and monitoring. So the next task, again, in partnership with Tetra Tech and Plastic Pollution Action Team, was to develop a conceptual ecological risk assessment. You'll hear me say ERA probably through this talk. I'm talking about a risk assessment. So we worked together to determine a biological endpoint, develop food web interactions, and develop semi-quantitative food web scenarios across different salinities. Young of year striped bass was selected as our endpoint for the ERA. Striped bass are an iconic species in the watershed and provide a good model endpoint because they're an apex predator. So when you develop their food webs, other important species of interest naturally fall within that research trophic transfer. And then you'll see just a simplified diagram that would show generalized uptake of microplastics in the different media specific to striped bass. I know this is a kind of a hefty slide here, but I'll break it down a little. So for this risk assessment, the stressor was microplastics. We kept the definition of microplastics pretty broad and all-encompassing, meaning that we didn't pick a specific composition type. Like we didn't say we're looking specifically at polypropylene or a specific size, like we're specific, or shape. We're not looking specifically at microfibers. We kept it broad. Future iterations, we may drill down a little bit more as more data comes out, but just for this purposes, the stressor was just microplastics. Assessment endpoints reflect potential individual and populational level effects of microplastics on striped bass. The model considers multiple sources. We've got wastewater, runoff, anthropogenic activities. We considered different media, water, sediment, and air. And then also different exposure routes, whether it's from direct uptake, for instance, through digestion. And then these exposures could lead to toxicity or behavioral changes, like, for example, making them more susceptible to predation, which is why diet data is so important to identify and understand, because it could be an important and an abundant exposure route. So briefly, the red priority levels indicated in this chart are top data needs to identify measurements of microplastics in different prey category. These red highlighted species are going to be discussed in a later project. It is hypothesized that microplastics may impact growth and survival by several different mechanisms, including blockages to reduce feeding, behavioral changes, increasing predation, and increased toxicity. The last task, sorry, that's a tongue twister, in this project was develop a science strategy to address microplastics in the Bay. It was modeled after the San Francisco approach. The strategy was intended to be a starting point to start to prioritize different research ideas, monitoring efforts, and policy development. It's intended to be a living document and can be updated as needed and as priorities shift. The initial projects that I just discussed were all in response to that workshop that the STAC did in 2019. We were able to identify some key data gaps. For example, some of them were the ecological effects of microplastics on living resources. We need more studies on the prevalence and effects microplastic contamination will have on species, their prey, and the environment. in order to really support robust risk assessments. And then we need to continue developing our understanding of the risk microplastics play to humans in the ecosystem. Overall, the project and its tasks led the team to a few conclusions. What we know is that they are ubiquitous in tidal and non-tidal waters. The consensus is that it's a widespread but unquantified problem. There's no systematic organized effort to monitor or research plastic in the watershed. The risk assessment demonstrated that microplastics could impact valuable resources, like, for example, the striped bass. And then we recommend implementing the science and monitoring strategy as a way to better be strategic and focused in our efforts to address this issue. In 2022, EPA provided additional funds to update the ERA, where we drilled down and focused on some specific prey taxa. The updated risk assessment considered plankton shifts, incorporated new striped bass diet studies, and a specific focus on mysids, amphipods, and bay anchovies, which were identified in red in that slide, in the slides a few slides ago. And then we also put out a supplemental report, which has linkages between where microplastics and the Chesapeake Bay program agreement goals might overlap. So just recently, I'm very excited to share that EPA, its contractor Tetra Tech, and the Plastic Pollution Action Team completed a framework for monitoring plastic pollution in the Chesapeake Bay. This was a huge effort. I encourage everyone to check out our website and check out this framework. It really breaks down and makes recommendations on how to monitor across different media, so surface water, sediment, living resources, and it discusses the scale, the frequency, the location. And I think the most important thing that this framework does is it looks at leveraging existing programs, so we can limit how much resources are required to implement this monitoring strategy. So they go through and look at watershed-wide, state, local monitoring programs that are already existing and figure out how to best integrate them. So it's really exciting for us. And then it also includes a field sampling reference guide and lab reference guide. I know, Denise, I'm out of time. There's a bunch of recommendations on that monitoring framework, which again, I'll tell you to go online and check out. But whoops, quickly, we have some goals of establishing a no net increase, conducting more sampling, looking at including analysis of water and sediment. So that's all in the document. Briefly, I just want to summarize how impactful the Plastic Pollution Action Team has been. We've done a lot of work from 2019, as you can see on this timeline, and we are not slowing down. Current projects, we have 2 that EPA is funding, again, in partnership with the PPAT. The first one's a lab-based study coupled with some field work looking at contaminated mysid shrimp populations and exposing them to juvenile striped bass and looking at reactions and then getting real environmental loadings. And then a source tracking study in partnership with EPA's Office of Research and Design, looking at different land use types and conveyances and the types and volume of plastics. So is wastewater showing a more dominant type of plastic than, say, a wetland or an urban or a suburban land cover? Those projects are underway and will be completed next year. Here's our website, my email, and I'm only 1 minute over, 1.5, and I talk fast. I'm from Philly. Well, outside Philly.
Oh, thanks, Kelly. That was great. That was really packed. And thanks, Lauren. Lauren has put a lot of links to the resources that Kelly's been mentioning in the chat. And Renee, the floor is now yours.
All right. Thank you, Denise. And thank you, Kelly, for a wonderful presentation. I'm originally from West Virginia, so I don't speak nearly as quickly, but I will do my best here. Okay. Let me screen share here. Okay. Do we all see a blue start screen? Great.
Yes.
Okay. All right. As Denise so kindly mentioned in the introduction, I am with CCRM, and today I will be talking about marine debris and what our focus is here with the nationwide fishing trap removal assessment and prevention program, or what we simply call the TRAP program here. Okay. So I just wanted to start with a little graphic here to kind of orient everybody to thinking about what type of derelict gear we work with here for the TRAP program. So the vast majority of our focus is on derelict traps. So what is a derelict trap? Essentially, we're looking at the various types of fishing traps, be it for a variety of species of crab, lobster. Here in the bay, we're mostly looking at blue crab traps that for whatever reason has become abandoned, lost, or otherwise discarded. So our graphic here on the left starts out with what we would like to see a crab trap here in the bay look like. So we see, the two little orange areas, those, and we'll look at more of these, but those are BRDs, so bycatch reduction devices. So species can escape through those panels if need be. We'll talk a little more there, but we can see a line is appropriately attached, a buoy is appropriately attached. So this trap is doing its job and it's well marked for everyone. So as we scoot across here, we see that our crab trap is having a little trouble. So when a trap becomes derelict, we'll talk about this, but there's a variety of reasons that can happen. Really common reasons in this area, and quite frankly, throughout the global coastal communities. And this is something I'll also speak to. This isn't just a bay-wide problem. It's not just a US problem, even though we're addressing this as a nationwide program. It's truly a global problem. Anywhere with a coastline and a fishery has this issue. So it's not just us here. But things like bad weather. So say, a bad storm comes in, you're not in town. You don't have time to pull your lines for your traps. They could become separated and the trap could become derelict that way. A recreational boater could come by and accidentally cut that line unknowingly. So there's lots of things that can happen. Quite frankly, vandalism can happen. The gear not being set up properly in the first place, faulty gear. So lots of things can cause this issue with derelict or otherwise abandoned traps. So when this happens, we essentially are left with a trap that is doing what we refer to as ghost fishing. So essentially, creatures are still continuing to go on these traps, even though they're not being actively fished, because if I were a blue crab, I wouldn't know the difference between an active crab pot and one that's been left behind. So, both our target species, such as blue crabs here, and other species, including vulnerable species, such as diamondback terrapins, often find themselves in these traps. They essentially ghost fish indefinitely as long as the trap structure is still in place. So these traps can essentially continue to ghost fish and cause major issues with bycatch mortality for many years, depending on where you're at and how the trap, is situated in the water. So our main goal here is to get as much of this stuff out of our coastal waterways as we possibly can. So I'll direct everyone's attention up to our waterman on his very nifty boat here. So this example shows a waterman going out and using sonar to determine the locations of these abandoned traps. But we can also just use visual surveys. That's quite common in this area as well, since most of these are typically not in super deep waters or anything. But essentially, the trap will then be collected. Any organisms inside are documented, photographed, and if anything is still living, it's re-released into the water. Everything else is just essentially waste. Okay. So as I was mentioning, there's a variety of reasons that traps can get lost. As I mentioned, bad weather. One I didn't mention yet is actually wildlife can come by and damage these things. So, you could have something chewing on the lines that could cause that trap to become derelict. There have been fisheries where these things are purposefully discarded. Back in the late 90s, when the American lobster fishery in the Northeast essentially collapsed, lots of companies that these watermen were working for actually encouraged them to handle it that way because economically that was the, hate to say this, best solution at the time. So there's lots of different things that we can see cause this issue. So what have we been doing about it so far? Before we launched our nationwide program, we had a Virginia-based program where we essentially had watermen go during the closed season for blue crabs and collect these traps. It was super successful. This program ran from 2008 to 2014. This was, a collaboration between us here at VIMS and CCRM, the Virginia watermen, as well as the VMRC was very, very successful. And you can see here some of our numbers for what we collected during those years. Now you'll see here our last couple of years, not nearly as many traps and things were collected. That wasn't because, the prior years had actually gotten all this stuff out of the water. It was just there was much less funding, so we had a lot less people out doing the work in general. But the majority of what we got out were blue crab pods, as well as some peeler pods. We also collected eel pods and nets, but those weren't as much of a focus. But what we discovered is essentially this work needs redone every year because there's a certain percentage of these traps that, for whatever reason, even with the best of intentions, are going to become lost. Okay. And I know we're focused on the bay here today, but I just wanted to briefly show everyone a little map here looking at the various trap style fisheries that we see around the globe. So lots of different areas throughout Asia, Australia, Oceania, Europe, North and South America also experience these issues with their trap style fisheries. So here we can see some of the work that we conducted here in the Bay in Virginia. So through that program we had going here in Virginia until 2014, we collected about 34,000 traps. Each of these tiny little red dots represents a trap that was collected. We can see that these traps end up all kinds of places that they should not. So even, if you're not a waterman yourself, you could be impacted by this issue in ways that you really didn't even think about. Okay. So we also modeled our, expectations for the derelict traps throughout the Chesapeake. And then we actually, went out and did these removals, and we found out that our model was actually quite accurate. So we're looking at approximately 145,000 traps out there in the Chesapeake total. And for example, here we can see further north in our study area here, a certain location was predicted to have 1,147. We actually went out, surveyed, and did removals in that area and found 1,192, so it was quite close. Okay. And then we know that our focus here, as mentioned, is blue crabs. So, for the bycatch mortality, how significant is this? I believe Denise prefaced our conversation by mentioning that over 3 million market-sized blue crabs are killed each year because of this issue with derelict traps and ghost fishing. So huge issue here. Depending on the part of the bay that you are in, anywhere from 16 to 26 marketable size blue crabs are typically killed in a derelict trap per year. And as mentioned, if those aren't retrieved and removed from the water, they'll continue to do that year over year. I know this picture's sad and a little dark, but I briefly mentioned the diamondback terrapin in the area, and they are so drawn to these traps. So it's truly an issue here with that particular vulnerable species. The the diamondback terrapin here, they have almost an exact mirror range of the blue crab. So they're very commonly found in these. I promise when we took this video, no diamondback terrapins were harmed in the making of this film. This brief video, we pulled this trap as soon as we were done. But you can see here, one trap we collected had 94 terrapins in it. But right on time, our terrapin friend went into the trap there. And typically, instinctually, the terrapin will try to swim up in the trap versus the area that they came in the trap. And as an air-breathing species, they can stay down anywhere from 45 minutes, right on schedule here. Like I said, they swim up to try to get out. So 45 minutes to 2 hours. And then unfortunately, if they're still stuck in that trap, they do drown. So they have a really hard time getting out of those traps. Now we can see on the bottom left side of the screen, and actually the trap here does have the bycatch reduction devices, but we've tried out a few different types here. We've actually created some models here at CCRM. So we've discovered that these longer rectangular options, as well as the kind of elongated ovals, do quite well with terrapins and some other species as well, including smaller blue crabs that wouldn't be market size anyway, are able to escape through those panels. I will say that Virginia is a little behind the game compared to the other East Coast states. We're actually the only state that doesn't have any type of requirement for a bycatch reduction device on the East Coast for these traps. And here are just some photos of the filth that one finds when pulling up a derelict trap here. And some more images. You can see, significant bycatch in these. Okay. And this shows, I know we've seen, the plotted out, the different removal locations, but this kind of shows you how many blue crabs we're finding in each of these areas. So we can see, there's a particular concentration higher up in Northern Virginia when looking at kind of these hotspot areas. Same pattern holds true for male crabs as well. And as mentioned, so, across the bay, we're looking at, a pretty big range of blue crabs that are, killed per trap per year on these derelict traps here. Here in Virginia, we have a higher number than they're seeing in Maryland. So right now we're sitting at about 25, whereas Maryland is looking at about 16. We see similar numbers in other areas that are doing this. So North Carolina is sitting at 19, Louisiana is similar to us with about 26. So if we don't care about the wildlife, perhaps we care about the money associated with this. So harvest for these fisheries is definitely significantly impacted by these derelict traps being in the water. So our program here in Virginia led to over 38 million pounds in additional harvest year over year, a 24% increase. And at that point in time, looking at over $33 million added to those harvest dollars. So a huge change there. Okay. And I just wanted to show here, so there are many groups that have been conducting these removals for, a number of years. Excellent efforts, but the efforts have been relatively disjointed. So there has not been a program that has really created a standardization for data collected for these removals. So it's really hard to compare, get trends, and really understand what we could do, nationwide to really help with these issues. So that was kind of the point behind creating the nationwide program in the first place, was to pull all of these efforts together and to actually create, a way to get the types of data that are needed for all of these programs and have it be really consistent. So just wanted to share, how excited we are about this program. Now, we started setting everything up about this time last year, but this is our first year of removals, and then we will have at least 4 years in the program, hopefully a 5th year, and hopefully it will go on indefinitely. We will see. But at the time, this was the largest award in VIMS history, so we're really proud of that. We also have a policy innovation lab associated with this between us here at VIMS and the University of Georgia Law School to, help work on policy recommendations from our findings throughout these next few years, working with policymakers and things. And I will also say, I can't say who, but we have selected our first year's Sept awardees for this program. So for those groups who will be actually going out and collecting these materials in our coastal waterways. And we're very, very happy to say that we received, a really robust group of applications, and we are going to have projects running with a really wide geographic representation, as well as essentially representing every trap style fishery in the country with these removals in year 1. So we're really happy to share that, and I'm happy to talk with you all more. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Renee and Kelly. Just to remind our audience, we do have some questions that were submitted beforehand, but please, we love to see the chat just full of them to keep it active. So please go ahead and do that. Put your questions in the chat. But I do have a starting question for both Kelly and Renee, because it's really interesting, the questions that were submitted beforehand. It's asking about should the responsibility be on the producers of the problem, or how do we balance the responsibility of the individual with that of the government to regulate harmful waste? And so, like Renee, I'm shocked that Virginia doesn't have a requirement, right, for bycatch reduction. But can you both in both microplastics for Kelly and then for this derelict gear, Renee, can you kind of talk about that balance between um, what's the responsibility of the individual versus that of the government to regulate the problem? And maybe I'll start with you, Kelly, because it's you've had time to think. Renee's just got done.
Well, yeah. So I will give my healthy disclaimer that what I say today might not be the exact views of the EPA. So but I mean, I think in extended producer responsibility, EPR is definitely a really important strategy and something that has to be done in order to really make measurable differences in the amount of plastics that end up in our society. There is a responsibility of the consumer, but I think the blame has been on the consumer for so long. There's been a lot of pressures, and there's a lot of socioeconomic considerations that need to be thought of when we think of a consumer, and what's available to them. So I do think that that a consumer can make obviously behavioral choices. There's things that we can do every day, whether it's, using reusables or, not balloon releases, no more plastic bags, those things. And they will make changes. Now, I don't know if there's any sort of kind of study done that off the top of my head that really measures an individual's impact versus a production company. Like, I'm not even going to name any companies, but I think we can all think of the ones that we think of. Like, I think that their impact is going to be the one that makes major headways in how we can reduce some of these single-use plastics. And even when it comes to packaging materials, there's a lot of movement there. But I do think that again, Kelly thinks that the responsibility could be heavily swayed towards the producer, considering that the consumer, there is stuff we can do, but some stuff is out of our hands because there's just not product availability maybe. And again, we have to think of people in different socioeconomic classes and what's available to them.
Yeah, I will just say after the first stack workshop on microplastics, I went through a personal challenge at home. Like, I just tried to eliminate plastics from the bathroom. It was really, really difficult.
And expensive.
Really difficult.
It's really expensive when you're making those decisions. And I mean, not everyone has to make that decision, but I have to make those decisions all the time about what product. And unfortunately, it's often cheaper so I can see why it's a real challenge for people to really go plastic free and all of the different ways. Now, there's certainly tools out there, especially with like everyday cleaning supplies. There's a lot of bulk you can get. There's new bulk stores coming up everywhere. But I mean, people have full-time jobs and kids, and they can't always go to the fancy, open box soap store and things like that. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to meet people where they are as well, because we have to be realistic when it comes to consumer and what expectations we can have with changes. And I think that's why extended producer responsibility and the policies and the research into that kind of field is going to be a really productive focus when it comes to source reduction.
Yeah. Renee, you've got a little bit of a different problem because you've gotten both recreational and commercial users of gear. And so how does that whole sort of question play into your world about, what responsibility gets placed on either the commercial or the recreational fisher person, and then what should be policy?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, Denise. So, like you said, we have both recreational folks and both recreational fishers and recreational boaters who aren't fishing, but who may accidentally cut a line, right? So I think that the education and outreach component of our work and just, focused on this in general is really important. So, we're looking at ways to proactively mitigate the problem, knowing that, similar to what Kelly had to say, I mean, this problem isn't likely to go away anytime soon, just being realistic. But, what pieces can we do to educate and try to proactively mitigate on the front end? So, what can we do to, talk with commercial, water person operations like this, where, we can set standards for not doing things like, abandoning gear, right?
Mhm.
Not intentionally abandoning gear, because we know that there have been a lot of instances of that. How do we get information and education out to, the recreational boating community to ensure that they understand, hey, here's these other uses, of our water resources that are happening right around you. Here's how you can help, not add to this issue here. So, I think there's definitely a challenge of how to get that information out to certain individuals, especially individual recreational users and recreational watermen. But when we get that information out, I do think that, there is some individual responsibility that should be there to be a responsible steward of our resources, just like
Mhm.
anything else one would go do. I don't really see that as any different than taking a hike, not littering, leave no trace, things like that.
Yeah.
But I think a huge piece of this relies on government policy, because we know that there is no perfect scenario where we're not going to have some of these traps accidentally be discarded. So that's where I think, things like the bycatch reduction device requirements are critical, regardless of what state you're in. And, creating policy that is friendly to groups who are actually trying to go out and do these removals, depending on where you're at. Some states, have friendly policies that allow for these types of
Mm.
operations via permitting and things, and other places it's really difficult to, even get an agreement of, hey, this thing's been derelict here for 20 years. We know no one's
Right.
touched it. We're still not allowed to. So just creating policies that, make it easier to get that stuff out of the water.
Can you talk about, and there's a question in the chat that I was
Mhm.
going to follow up with anyway. You wouldn't have to have so much attention on removal if everybody had biodegradable excluder devices, correct? Like, can you talk about the question in the chat is
Yeah.
how do biodegradable excluder devices affect ghost fishing of derelict crab pots?
Yeah, I see that question. And thank you for asking, Joseph. That's an excellent question. So it depends on where you're at. And I would also say, I'm a huge, proponent of having the biodegradable components and having some element of BRDs on all of these traps. But there's still the element of habitat degradation if we're not getting these traps out of the water. So there's definitely an issue there. It is important to remove them. However, for the bycatch mortality, the wildlife issue, the fish and wildlife issue we're looking at here, the biodegradable components are very helpful. They're very useful in our area. Um, they typically take a lot longer to break down in colder waters. So say you're in the Northeast, say we're looking at our Washington State projects, or say we have a project in Alaska, that's going to take a really long time to break down those biodegradable components. So depending on where you're at, depends on when that actually starts working for you. And just because it's marketed to, break down in, say, 6 months, it depends on where
Mhm.
you're using it, if that's going to
Mm.
happen. So the biodegradable, it's great. We have biodegradable polymers. There's different areas that use, like cotton, twine, jute string, and things like that that break down quicker. So that's a nice way to consider it as well. I think they're a great resource, but I think we need more than that considering the different locations we have.
Mhm. Thanks. Ke-
Mhm.
Kelly, a question for you is, and I was struck by your comment, that describes microplastics in the in the bay as a widespread but unquantified issue. So, how important is it to quantify the issue if we know it's widespread and it has potential impacts, which I think could be significant? Can you talk about little about that in terms of, what are the gaps in our knowledge that are especially important to fill at this point in time?
Yeah. So the big question, which is what risk assessments do, is how much is too much, right? That's the question. And how much is too much for whom and what? So is what values are a threshold for an oyster versus striped bass versus a human? So these are big questions. So without having those numbers, those baseline numbers on the volume or the total counts, and then and then specifically as well, certain compositions, meaning certain plastic types, whether it's a polyethylene or a polypropylene, might have different effects on different species. So those chemical components might have different toxicity effects. So we really need to know what's there if we're also going to understand the risks, like what is at most at risk. So we know it's there, and there's piecemeal efforts where things have been quantified. There's specific species that have been studied. There's specific waterways that have been studied. But I think having a systematic baseline approach to monitoring, which is what the framework recommends, then we can look at status and trends, so we can start to see how much is being added, right? So then we can kind of predict potential risks. So that's kind of where we're at. I mean, it's a lot, but there's so many questions because there's new papers that come out, gosh, every day, every hour at this point, I feel like. So looking at the most valuable resources in our watershed, whether it's economic resources, cultural resources, human resources, where do they have thresholds for microplastics? Are they specific to the type of microplastics they are? And is there a threshold for how much? And those are questions that are important when we build out these risk assessments. So having those loadings of what's there and then what's still entering is really important.
And let me just stay with you, Kelly, for a moment and talk about being that the issue is at the state it's at and the state of knowledge we have. You always know, wouldn't you go after source reduction in a big way first? Just because it's like sipping from a fire hose, right? It's an extreme amount, just keeps coming in. And so can't you do that before you know the answer to every question about impacts?
Yeah, I mean, but to identify the sources, I feel like we still need some information on, in order to figure out what the sources are, we kind of need to know what plastics are there. So, I mean, I think there's probably some point sources that may be more evidence, like clear, than maybe some of our non-point sources, whether it's, runoff or spraying or what have you. So I don't know if there's like a perfect approach. Source reduction is certainly a priority and still on the PPAT's original charge that came from the management board. It's something we haven't started addressing, would be a strategy. We've definitely talked about it. We've had some groups talk about how we would do or recommend source reductions, like some easy low-hanging fruit wins that we talked about. And then we do have this study currently underway it's really scraping the surface of source tracking, really scraping the surface, but looking at the different land use types and the plastics coming from them. So yeah, I mean, I kind of think you have to, it feels really overwhelming because I feel like you kind of have to do all of it at once. You need to know what's there in order to treat the problem, but like, you also kind of need to treat the problem while the problem's happening. So I think you could approach it many different ways. But in my personal mind, I feel like we kind of need to know what's there to even figure out what the sources are.
Yeah, thanks. That was a really great response. It was really informative. Renee, for you, what's the best way if we've got to get them out, right? If we've got to get the debris out? The project with the watermen was so successful. Like, how are we going to get them out? Like, are there some promising programs about doing that? It seemed like it was so successful from the watermen. Why aren't we just kind of doing that everywhere? Or what are sort of promising programs or ways for debris removal?
Yeah, good question. So here, that was obviously very, very successful. It depends on the area where you're at, whether you have, a group of people who are capable of, going out and doing these removals. So you need people, with the right equipment to be able to do this, or, the experience, or at least, someone to train them to be able to do this work here in Virginia. We have more people than we could use probably, who would love to go out and do this work, but that's not true everywhere. Or at least, there may be the interest, but these folks don't have, the boats they need, don't have the equipment they need. So, how do we get funding to these individuals who can and do want to do the work, but right now don't have the proper setup, right, to make that happen. So here, that was so successful. And, of course, we pay the watermen per day that they go out and do these things. So, of course, no one's doing this, just out of the goodness of their heart as much as we would like. But this time around, we will be hiring 10 Virginia watermen who have all worked with us before to essentially recreate that effort here in Virginia. But some places, so, we have certain localities where the types of traps, due to the species that they are, they're very deep water traps. So we have to have professional divers go down and do those. So it wouldn't be, as useful to, someone go by, do a visual survey and, you pull it right up. That's just not possible for all of the different types of fisheries. So while it works really well here, some places we need folks with a really specialized skill set to be able to do it.
I'm going to ask each of you, what can recreators, water users, just private people, what can you do? I mean, in each instance, both for derelict gear and for the microplastics issue. So maybe Kelly, I'll go to you. What's
Yeah, I think being a good steward. If you're talking at an individual level, at a personal level, I think understanding and being a good steward. Whether it's participating and volunteering in trash cleanups, like it drives me nuts. Like people that say, "Oh, I don't litter," but then they throw a cigarette butt out their car window. I'm like, that is litter. Like it is plastic litter. For some reason, cigarettes have this like hall pass of being considered litter in my. That's just what I see. So just like being aware of all the different cool programs that are out there. There's certainly restaurants that are being, much more environmentally friendly with reusables or more friendly takeout containers. Just all the different ways that you can make small differences is really, I think, a good step. And then leading by example, it's really, really hard. But as stores and companies see that consumers want these products, they want reusables, they want, to feel like bring your own coffee mug. I know, for example, one of the big chain coffee places won't take your reusable for like liability reasons. So it's kind of like, just like those kind of things. And then getting the word out is there's, Plastic Free July is like a big movement, and supporting, a lot of on the boots organizations that are doing big cleanups and trying to get funding for different types of removal and source reduction work.
There is a great question that just got submitted in the chat. Do the compostable plastic products, think pet waste bags and disposable utensils, contribute to the microplastic load?
Yeah, so the compostable, I'm certainly not an expert on like the sustainable material stuff. We have folks that really work on that. And my understanding is those compostable plastic products, like they have to go to a very specific factory to be properly, broken down, where it's not something you can just put in your normal waste stream and then it naturally breaks down in the landfill. So I think if the organization, company, whatever restaurant has these items and they're actually going through the proper route of bringing it to the right facility, then yeah, they're great. But I think if you buy them for your family party and throw them in the trash, I'm not sure that they're making the impact that they're supposed to make.
Oh, thank you. Renee, what's something individuals can do about derelict gear? Is there any sort of certification for certain fisheries, or is there what do you do when you're, out boating, right?
Right.
Or using the water.
Yeah, so a recommendation I have that immediately popped to mind is we actually have a citizen science app here at CCRM where people can take photos and document
Mm,
anything that they find, including during the closed seasons, right? When those items can be collected. So it's called our Crab Trap app. And Denise, if you want, I will get a link to that because absolutely anyone out on the water, anything that you find, see, you can document through that. And that's really useful for our work as well because our main focus with the trap program, of course, involves, our researchers and our folks on the ground who are actually going to be collecting in mass, and removing those traps. But I mean, we're talking about the importance of, individual responsibility and stewardship here. So, the more folks we have work on that citizen science app and, put things in as they see them, that's really helpful for us as well. And it helps us, even if that person, isn't trying to say, hey, I'm going to go out and I'm going to collect these traps myself. If you document where those things are found, then that helps us map and establish where hotspots are, and then we can go and collect those materials.
great.
Yeah,
Great. Thanks for bringing that up.
of course.
Let me go back to Kelly for just a moment because there was a question beforehand. How are volunteer trash cleanup efforts effective in reducing load?
I mean, they definitely get out what's there, but do they cure the problem? No.
No.
So the problem is, is it stormwater management issues? Is it illegal dumping, mismanaged trash? So, yes, they get plastics from potentially getting in the waterways off if they're currently beached or on a river shore, but they don't really fix the problem of why there's mismanaged or illegally dumped trash sitting on that river shore or bay shore. So it's a
Thank
yes
you.
and no thing. But I do think that some of those volunteer cleanups, like it's always fun and funny to see like the younger kids, they had no idea like that the trash that they throw away in their kitchen or at their school could potentially end up on the banks of the waterway. Like it's like that there's a disconnect between your home litter and then litter that ends up mismanaged and in the waterways. And then there's a huge misconception about the effectiveness of recycling, and how much recycling is being done and how it's being like, if you consume if you have plastic water bottles and they're recycled, well, you're not part of the problem. There's like this idea out there about the effectiveness of recycling. And we just know that I don't have the percentage, but a fraction of what actually goes into recycling is properly recycled and reused.
Yeah, I think it's about 11%.
Yeah, I was
It's
going to say,
shockingly low.
my idea was like 20, but I was afraid to say it because I didn't know where that was, if that was just in my head. But yeah, and I think people don't realize, I mean, if I weren't in the know and I had went to the store and got a Gatorade or vitamin water and put it in recycling, I would think I did what I was supposed to do, not knowing that most likely that is not getting recycled. So
Okay,
that's a mismarketing.
well, I want to thank you both, and we are really close. I'm going to give you each just like 10, 15 seconds. What's something you'd like everyone to leave with? Renee?
Bycatch reduction devices are good. Just being mindful in general about behaviors out on the water, and thinking of ways to minimize any potential interaction with those types of traps and things like that is great.
Great. Thank you. Kelly?
Yeah, I guess my closing thoughts are always like, I don't want people to think plastics are awful because they have some, I mean, blood bags, plexiglass, they've had some life-saving skills. It's the single-use plastics that have really overtaken our society, our convenience society. So as much as I don't like to fully put the onus on a consumer, where an individual is possible to make that difference, it could potentially create a ripple effect and make other folks more conscious as a consumer until we can address producers. Which I don't like putting the responsibility totally on a consumer, but if there's things we can do, I would try to take like what Denise did, that plastic in your bathroom, how to get rid of it. It's harder than you think. And when you really take inventory of your life, you won't sleep well about what plastics you have.
Yeah. Well, on that sleepless note,
Sorry, everyone.
No. Thank you both. That was really informative and very, very helpful. And thanks to everyone for asking those wonderful questions. And join us next month. We're back at it. So thanks, everyone. And Kelly and Renee, again, thank you very, very much.
Bye, everyone.